introductions, and then we've got our 2 agenda items. And instead of Allison Craig, who might not be able to get on, Laura Harmon's going to launch us with the UDO update. So let's go ahead with introductions. Lynn, do you want to start?
Lynn Alexander, Charlotte DOT.
Liz Babson, Charlotte DOT.
Yolanda Jones, Planning.
Donata Jackson, Office of Constituent Services.
Braxton Winston, committee member.
Julie Eisel, Committee Chair.
John Howard, Katz.
Candace Roy, Planning.
Jason Lawrence, Charlotte Area Transit System.
Rebecca Hefner, Housing and Neighborhood Services.
Thank you. Let's go with our committee members online, and then we'll go with staff online.
Larkin Eggleston, Committee Vice Chair.
Victoria Watlington, District 3.
Committee, council member guests,
Ed Driggs, District 7.
and then staff. Uh-oh. We couldn't hear that, Laura.
Supposed to be doing the theory.
She was just going to do the introduction. So we have somebody do the presentation.
Okay, well, we'll make do. Is that laryngitis, Laura, or your audio?
I think maybe her audio.
Okay,
It doesn't sound like it's my audio.
it's your audio,
The
yeah.
audio is breaking up. The audio is definitely breaking up.
Who else do we have online?
This Malcolm.
Oh, great, thank you, Malcolm. And Matt, we have a couple other guests. You want to introduce yourselves?
Yes, this is Matt Prosser with Economic and Planning Systems.
And David Green with Perkins and Will.
Okay, is that everybody?
Allison Craig from Planning.
Oh, Allison. All
Kevin
right.
May Planning, excuse me, Kevin May Planning Staff.
Okay.
Wozniak, Planning Staff.
Is that everybody?
Ed McKinney, Charlotte DOT.
Okay, I think that's everybody. Thank you, and thank you, Ed and Allison, for chiming in from vacation. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I don't know who we want to kick off UDO. Laura, do you want to go ahead and try it? Allison, do you want to just give a little introduction, and then we'll get into the presentation? We can't hear Laura.
Sure. Thanks, Mayor Pro Tem. Yes, so today we're going to give you a brief update about the economic impact analysis that our consultants are doing. And so this is really some preliminary findings that the consultants are going to update the committee on, and then we're going to sort of a snapshot. And then we have a stakeholder meeting later this week where we'll get into more of the details. And we'll be back before committee with some of those findings, the finalized findings, which are, of course, being used to inform the changes that will come in the next draft of the UDO, which we're anticipating for later on in May. And so we've got Matt from EPS and David from Perkins and Will, and I will turn things over to Matt to start off the presentation.
Thank you, Allison. Go ahead, Matt and David.
Yes, thank you. It's great to be with you guys again. We're going to give you an overview of some preliminary findings that we have. We're really going to first start talking about the purpose of the study, then outcomes and findings, and then give you a little bit of an update of next steps in the schedule. So next slide, please. Just a reminder, really the purpose of this study is to help identify potential refinements to the draft UDO based on both detailed financial analysis, but also detailed physical design review and analysis that David Green with Perkins and Will has completed. Next slide. And so our process started really with identifying as many issues or key changes within the UDO from current regulations that we felt influenced the feasibility or the cost of development, and then went through a lot of testing of different potential outcomes from a physical perspective, but also from a financial perspective. And we are now to the point where we are developing and finalizing some recommendations for in terms of changes for staff and you all to consider, and then also sort of our takeaways. Next slide. So again, just a reminder, the UDO is one of the major implementation tools of the 2040 comprehensive plan. And so a lot of what the UDO is trying to do is translate sort of large scale policy into physical outcomes, physical development outcomes. And that is directed first through the policy map and then through the zone districts and regulations within the UDO. And so a lot of the intent and purpose of the different regulations that are in the UDO are really meant to implement those ideas and concepts that are within the comprehensive plan. Next slide. And so, as I mentioned, it's really aimed at implementing the community's vision, and two of the sort of primary intents of the UDO that we've identified or worked or been focused on really are how the UDO promotes economic development that balances the needs of the current and future economy. And then how can the UDO preserve and enhance the character of places and communities within Charlotte? Next slide. And really that's looking at how are we investing in our future to make the community a great place to live, but also balancing that against the required investments needed. And if the investments required are really producing the returns that the community is desiring and the returns that the market is going to require to be able to implement them. And that alignment is really the key of what we're trying to identify. So next slide. We had a really robust engagement process that's ongoing. Many interactive workshops where we were having discussions with a pretty broad range of stakeholders within the development community, from designers to engineers and up to developers and even capital investment folks. And really they're organized around, and we'll show this in a second, sort of 5 key areas to make sure that we could hone in on specific development types. And all in all, I think we had over 50 stakeholders participate. So really robust discussion and really a lot of participation from the development community to work with us collaboratively to identify potential impacts. Next slide. And so these are the 5 groups that we've sort of been organized in. They are aligned kind of roughly with different place types or types of development. So employment-oriented development, mixed-use sort of activity center-oriented, more neighborhood-oriented development, and then specifically looking at adaptive reuse, which was something that was brought up by the stakeholders as an important thing to consider. And then sort of overlapping some of these groups was our 5th group, the affordable housing group, which looked at how do we support the development of affordable housing in all the different place types, but also how can we hone in on ways the UDO can be more flexible and encouraging for affordable housing projects in general. Next slide. So in terms of issue identification, next slide. We were looking at those through a couple different lenses in terms of economic issues and design issues. So from an economic perspective, we were really honed in on how efficiently the UDO allows for projects to be designed and laid out on a site. Really that is reflected in the amount of development potential or capacity that a site can yield. And then also looking at what are some of the cost implications of different regulations, and then how flexible is the process and the design, the development and design process, as that flexibility has a big impact on cost, but also the quality of projects that are built. Design-related issues included parking standards, open space requirements, tree save requirements, development intensity outcomes, and actually a number of other specific issues, but these were some of the top 4 ones that really are identified. Next slide. So as we moved into testing and analysis, next slide. We started sort of using this paradigm of understanding what's the balance between the investment that's required in a project or from the community and weighing that against the return that could be generated from a development project, whether that's returns to the community or returns to the developer, and making sure those sort of balance. Looking at the next slide, really that alignment of what's the investment that we are looking in our community and making sure that is producing the returns, like I said, from the community's perspective, but also from the development community's perspective, making sure those balance in a way that supports the continued growth of the community and doesn't create a situation that isn't creating the outcomes we want or is too onerous and might be preventing the types of development that the community would like to see. Next slide. And so when we dove into these issues from a design perspective, David and his group really looked at specific issues. So modeling designs for really specific issues, whether it's like stormwater or building heights. They also tested the zone districts over a large number of prototype sites, really what different iterations of development could come out on a prototypical site. And then we worked with the development community to identify a large number of actual sites or actual parcels that are contemplated for developments or projects that have already been built in the recent past, and evaluated how the UDO performs in terms of producing those projects, both in the current regulations and in the draft UDO. And we, EPS, used that design work to really look at what those implications are for cost, investment value, and return to get at the economic impacts of the UDO changes. Next slide. So David, I don't know, this might be a good spot for you to take over perhaps and talk about your design process and the findings you had.
Sure. So in this process, we structured it so that we could get sort of a parallel investigation and evaluation tying the physical issues to the economic impacts. And so these included looking at yield deltas. And so we evaluated, and I'll explain this in a bit more detail in a moment, but we evaluated the differences between what could be developed under the current zoning regulations and then the draft UDO. We also looked at it broadly, just on its own terms in the UDO for development efficiency, and then also to get a better understanding of the alignment between goals and outputs to make sure that the outputs we were getting from the development of each of these parcel types was aligned with the goals that were stated in the comprehensive plan as well as in the UDO itself. Next slide, please. And so we saw that there was value in this in a number of different categories and criteria. We were able to do a detailed tracking of comments and questions, and so we now have a repository of all of the comments that have come through this collaborative process, along with findings and recommendations for each of those. There was a transparency of outcomes so that the report is actually providing specific detailed information that describes the results of developing with the UDO. We have a series of very specific recommendations, and then we have a number of issues that are actionable for continued evaluation. And this is important because the UDO is considered not a static document upon its adoption, but something that can be refined into the future. And so it's not just those changes that might take place with the next draft, but also those things that might have a longer look for refinement and updating. Next slide, please. So our major findings were that development yields are generally similar or provide a slight increase between the two ordinances. And this is taking into consideration parcels that were done as rezonings, as well as parcels that were developed by right. There's an increase in open space requirements across the board. However, there's more flexibility in implementation and mitigating opportunities within the UDO so that on balance, it's fairly equal. The parking is simplified and in a way more aligned with the future vision for multimodal transport programs that the comprehensive plan envisions. It also provides more flexibility for solutions. And then the urban form is more consistent with the future vision for Charlotte as a connected, walkable city. So in general, we're seeing that there's a fairly strong alignment between the ultimate goals of the comprehensive plan the specific goals of the UDO and the outcomes that we tested. Next slide, please. We also looked at the breadth of findings, and so this was a process that was both macro and micro. At a granular level, we looked at issues as detailed as internal planting that has to do with how much you can plant on or how much you are required to plant on an individual parcel, open space dimensions, how big the open space has to be to count towards your requirement, very specific parking impacts, and even things like sidewall height for infill development on 1, 2, and 3 unit parcels. But that goes all the way to broad analyses looking at place type alignment. So the place type and how it's aligned with the zoning categories that are proposed, those category comparisons, both internal to the UDO, but also between the UDO and the current ordinance, organizational clarity, overall clarity of the UDO for use and operation by the general public, and then intent outcome evaluation. So how closely, in a broad sense, were we aligning the outcomes with the original intent? Next slide, please. So we were able to successfully, through this evaluation process, I think, increase the clarity of the language in a number of areas, expand flexibility of open space implementation, clarify some of the green area implementation components. As you know, this is a new area in the ordinance, and so this was critical. Provide potential expansion of bonus opportunities, provide confirmation of built form and confirmation of project yield, demonstrate a very specific process of planning each of these individual and varied sites, and then identification and hopefully resolution of any unintended outcomes that we determined through the analysis process. Next slide, please. And so some of the specific findings, next slide, please, were organized around, well, that's a very strange looking image, but imagine that that's not distorted and it's turned 90 degrees counterclockwise. We actually did detailed site analyses of a number of different sites that were representative in a broad way of sites across Charlotte. And so this is a project on Selwyn, and we were able to determine that there was a development equivalence yield between what was originally constructed on the site or proposed for the site and what would be constructed under the UDO. We were able to accommodate open space. There was some buyout for green area, which we didn't see as a problem, and the parking ratios aligned. Next slide, please. I'm not sure why these were all turned sideways. I'm very sorry about that, but this is another project at 7th and Caswell, a fairly new project that you all might know. And again, the findings, there are a number of findings. These are just sort of the high points, but we actually were able to increase the development yield on this site. The open space requirement had some additional constraints, and some of that needed to be relocated on the roof, which had a cost implication. But there was an opportunity for a total buyout for the green area, and the parking ratios aligned. Next slide, please. And then this was a larger multifamily project on Moorhead. There was a development yield equivalent, so you could, by and large, get the same amount of development in either case, either what was constructed or what's permissible under the UDO. We were able to accommodate all of the open space, although partial of that accommodation was on the rooftop. Again, 100% buyout for green area, and the parking ratios aligned. I will say that there were a number of specific issues that we also looked at that had to do with things like grades and service and active use on the ground floor. And all of these things were contemplated and addressed in this evaluation. Next slide, please. And then this was one of the examples we used for affordable housing. It's a project on Allegheny. And we were able to get, again, a development yield equivalence. And I think this is important that by and large, there's an equivalence of development yield between current projects, which were developed either as rezonings or as by right under the current regulations and the regulations outlined in the UDO. Open space was completely accommodated here. Green area was completely accommodated, and the parking ratios aligned. So the big issues in each of these were either directly aligned and applicable, or there was a way to resolve them to successfully be able to develop the project within the flexibility of the UDO. Next slide, please. And so again, all of these specific findings are outlined and tracked across multiple issues, along with recommendations, either short-term or long-term recommendations. They're organized by section in the draft UDO, so it's very easy to go in and understand exactly where the issues are, what the text is that is impacted, and then understand what the situation is, the issue is, and what some solution might be. Open space finding, again, just to get to the granular level, we were able to go in and analyze this and model this to understand the direct impact. And so in this case, it had an impact on smaller parcels, but not on larger parcels. So we're now able to go in and modify some of the language to accommodate that. Next slide, please. And then the same with green area. There were some issues with overlapping requirements, and we were able to go through and work a more sort of flexible solution for this that worked both to ensure that we're getting the amount of green area that we want to see emerge in Charlotte, but also we're not causing problematic constraints to development to get the urban form that we wanted to see in the development. I'm going to flip it back over to Matt, but before I do, I just want to say these are just examples of a much larger report that has much more detail. So Matt, I'll flip it back to you.
Great, thanks, David. Next slide, please. So kind of mirroring the findings that David had in terms of the economic study, three sort of major findings that we had. So first is, in our mind, there will be an improved development process that should result in less needs for rezonings or conditional zonings long term. Obviously, there will be some challenges and a fair amount of additional planning that will need to occur in terms of implementation in the community area planning process. The long term, we feel like this will start to achieve the goal of reducing that need, and we'll talk about that in a second. As David pointed out, generally the capacity for development is greater, which creates more value for the community and also potential for more housing, which is we think an important consideration. And then lastly, we do think the level of investment or the cost for projects will likely increase in most cases. And so this isn't a finding that there won't be increased costs related to certain regulations, but in general, we feel that is largely offset by greater development potential and an improved process. So there is some benefits and costs going. Next slide. In terms of process, two specific findings. We do think down the road, once the alignment rezoning has occurred and additional community area planning efforts have been completed, there will be less need for conditional zoning and rezoning, so more by right development. What we found is that a large number of projects currently require rezonings or conditional zoning districts. Looking at just multifamily projects over the last 2 or 3 years, we found over 40% of them were built using conditional zoning. And that doesn't even factor in the number that would need needed a rezoning to even be built. So there's already a really high number of projects that need some sort of special accommodation to even be built. And so the UDO in our mind is really going to reduce that barrier and that impact in terms of the development process once it's fully implemented. We also found that there are process improvements that are being implemented to help address conflicts. So one specific one is the introduction of a UDO administrator that helps negotiate and alleviate conflicts between the 6 other administrators that look at different aspects of the UDO, whether that's zoning or stormwater or the urban forester or even the subdivision requirements. And so when conflicts arise, the UDO administrator will step in and help alleviate and coordinate with the different administrators to figure out a path forward, which is an improvement to the process going forward. Next slide. In terms of development capacity specifically, like we said, there's greater potential for development. That plays out in 2 specific ways that we identified. First, there's more flexibility, as you all know, for middle density housing, specifically in our neighborhoods, our single-family neighborhoods, more opportunity for duplexes and triplexes, which has potential to add as many as 10,000 capacity for 10,000 new housing units, which is not a humongous number if we look at the total development capacity for the community, but impactful. As well as using the findings from David's research, we found about an 8% on average increase in yield of the different multifamily or mixed-use projects that we evaluated, and that will also increase capacity for development in that multifamily category. Next slide. We also looked at, so specifically looking at neighborhood 1 areas, that provision for being able to build duplexes or triplexes on single-family lots. We found that that can occur in most cases. We'll talk about one issue in a second that was a barrier, but in general, that creates more total investment in a project, but also leads to housing units created at a lower price point. Although maybe not affordable in sort of the definition ways, but still less than what we would produce if we were still just allowing single-family units. Next slide. So there are some barriers within the draft UDO that we've been working through, as David mentioned. And these, we think, need to continue to be addressed and discussed with staff and the development community. First, the open space and green area requirements are onerous without some overlap options, and we think there's more flexibility that can be created there. Building heights in general, we think, have a huge impact on development capacity and the economic feasibility of projects. So a couple of places that played out. First, there were requirements related to the sidewall height for duplexes and triplexes in single-family neighborhoods that was really low, only allowed for a one-story building at a certain setback from the lot line. And through this analysis, we were able to identify some potential alternatives which would allow duplexes or triplexes to occur when they likely wouldn't have been built with that requirement. And we know that there are challenges with transitioning from single-family neighborhoods to more mixed-use areas. And one way to potentially mitigate that transition is looking at height. And just want to be cautious that the restriction in height in some cases may have large impacts on the types of projects that can be built. And so we might be preventing the ability of certain multifamily projects to be built if we limit the height too much. So a consideration as we continue to think about ways to transition between neighborhoods and mixed use areas. The last capacity barrier that we wanted to highlight was the industrial building and block lengths were identified as being too short compared to sort of contemporary projects that are being built in the community. And so we've been working with the development community to identify potential changes to that to allow the more modern distribution buildings to be built under the UDO. Next slide. And then we also wanted to point out those specific, activity center or mixed use place impacts. So we do know that there's, on average, a slight increase in the amount of density that can be produced on these sites, which produces more project value, which we think has a positive economic impact. And we do know, though, however, there are some increased costs. And so just making sure that the increased costs with the regulations aren't necessarily overly outweighing the benefits that are generating, so that we have projects that are feasible and implementing the built form that we'd like to see in the community. Next slide. In terms of development investment findings or cost findings, we did find one thing that we've been working through is the impact on smaller projects. Obviously, as we start to require certain projects to provide more open space or things like that, a smaller project more and more is challenged to incorporate some of these things just because of the size of the site. And so we've been looking at some specific issues related to that. So There's some threshold issues related to when a conservation subdivision can be created, which impacts the frontage widths that are required. So we've been working through that. We're suggesting some more flexibility related to stormwater, post-construction stormwater regulations so that smaller sites can mitigate in a more flexible manner. And then looking at the impacts of requiring duplexes and triplexes to have parking on the sides or the rear of the buildings to eliminate the potential for several curb cuts along a street. And so by and large, that is a positive change, which increases walkability in the community. But as we look at smaller interior sites, it does have an implication on cost and project yield for certain small scale townhome or duplex or triplex projects. A couple of other issues that you may hear from the development community about are, first, the requirement that heritage trees be protected. This is a pretty new and potentially impactful change in the UDO that can be mitigated if the costs and the number of heritage trees are known. But a lot of times, new development sites, it's unclear the number of heritage trees that might be on a site and requires survey of that site to understand what the potential impacts for mitigation might be, which is a challenge and is hard to model the direct impact, but is something that may prevent development on certain sites, especially very wooded sites where the number of trees that need to be mitigated is hard to determine without fully investigating. Now, often that investigation occurs prior to a developer purchasing a site or even obtaining financing. And so it increases the upfront burden, which is a consideration we want to continue to discuss with staff. And then another area to consider is emerging technologies and how the UDO can be more sort of forward-looking in how it can plan for incorporating emerging technologies. But one of the issues we found is the EV charging requirements. Oh, I think we're going backwards in slides. Let's go forward. There are one more slide. There are requirements for either fully installed or pre-wired parking spaces in parking garages for electric vehicle charging, which may be too onerous and create too large of a cost for the benefit, or may be too onerous in terms of what will actually be needed in the future as technology changes. So something we're working through as well. Next slide. And this is just sort of an illustration of the impact on smaller sites versus medium-sized sites, and just finding that, addressing access, these tables on the right are the modeling outputs of the impact of providing parking on the rear of a building for a 4-unit townhome project versus a 14-unit townhome project, where the larger project or the medium-sized project can accommodate that requirement, but the smaller project cannot. And so just being cognizant that there might be a need for more flexibility for these smaller projects, and trying to figure out what those applicable thresholds are for that flexibility. Next slide. So to sort of wrap it all up, we are developing final reports, both an economic report and a design report. Next slide. Which we'll be sharing with the stakeholder group, and then ultimately bringing to you all and the full city council for consideration as staff moves into making revisions to the next draft of the EDO. So next slide. So just some next steps from us. We're obviously talking to you all today. We're finalizing our analysis and findings and updating our stakeholders on Wednesday this week. And then going forward, updating the ED committee on these same findings that we presented today, as well as working with staff to help support the release of the second draft that, to my understanding, should occur in May. So with that, I'll stop. That was a lot of information we presented, so happy to answer any questions that you all may have.
Thank you, Matt. That was a lot of information. I'm going to go around to committee members first to get questions. And I think, and this is really in general for council members, if we can kind of segregate the economic, like the numbers, our questions with regards to the numbers, and really put that in our ED committee, I think that would be helpful so that we can separate what works in practice in transportation and planning, and you know, not that we can't discuss it, but there's so much here to go through, and I know we're going to have a lot more questions, and I know Mr. Driggs, who's online, is going to have some questions regarding the economic development. And so I do think there is another opportunity to really dig into that through the ED committee. But first of all, let's go ahead and see which council members. I don't see hands raised. If you want to just raise your hand. Ms. Watlington, are you still on? She's there.
Yes, I'm here. I was in the presentation of ED committee, so I don't have any questions at this time.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Mr. Winston.
Yes, ma'am. So I'm going to try to say this as diplomatically as possible. This was my concern when this issue was kind of brought to the forefront during the comprehensive 2040 plan. I don't really see the utility of this process that we're in right now. I think it's way too zoomed in, and it doesn't give us the type of read and the type of look that we need, or I think what is generally wanted by the public. This feels very driven by technicals and, you know, kind of specific effects on individual firms' projects. When I think we need to be looking at a much more macro point of view. I always think it's foolish to try to prognosticate around planning, around what's going to happen in the future. You know, when you look at NODA, I don't think 30 years ago anybody thought it would be the cool part of town and would generate the type of development, you know, that it is doing now. When you look at the area that is Ballantyne 40 years ago, when it was one family's hunting grounds, I don't think you could anticipate that they would sell it and develop it at the type of scale, you know, that that it is being now. When you look at transportation and the way people move around, 10 years ago, you could not anticipate the disruptive effect of scooters and e-vehicles, and what kind of effect that would have on places like South End, or what's being called LoSo now. You know, so my point is the idea that we can kind of forecast this like a meteorologist is foolish. If we're going to do an economic impact study, I think what we need to do is look back at history and look back at the way these macro kind of growth patterns and growth strategies were implemented over wide areas of our city, and compare that to overlay the current plan and the current proposed recommendations. So what do I mean by that? Well, you know, you can look at, for instance, I'll pick 4 neighborhoods. And, you know, when you look at Uptown, and we always talk about the generation of wealth and the increased revenue that the center city has been created now that all of these towers are here. Well, that's all fine and good, but what if we compared that to growth strategies that are proposed here that would be overlaid? How do we compare that to, for instance, the removal of the generation of wealth when we raised Second Ward, and the impact on the type of revenue that could have been generated uptown had Second Ward been developed with the proposed, again, growth strategies, place types, and zoning districts that are in the comprehensive plan and the UDO. Would that have had a different type of effect on environmental justice and environmental impacts on people? And how does that translate economically? When we look at Ballantyne, right, you had that open green, that green space, basically, this virgin land that when the Harrises first developed it, we know that it has generated billions of dollars of economic activity, but we don't know if there could have been more or less had we overlaid these current regulations and policies. The same thing for NODA. Would we have the same type of cycles of gentrification that are occurring had we not had the current and proposed policies and regulations? What would the impact be on a place like Hidden Valley, you know, that again, dealing with the cycles of generation over a large, diverse neighborhood that is predominantly single-family zoned? I think by looking at that macro view and asking those kind of macro questions and looking at what has already occurred and overlaying it, that's the best chance that we can start to understand how we can implement this comprehensive plan and the true impacts. Of course, when you look at that macro view, you would have to take into certain concerns some of these very micro issues that are brought up in this presentation. But I don't think, but without that, I don't think you have a true economic analysis of what we're doing. It's dishonest. So again, this might be something that, you know, the development community is going to pick apart and analyze, and will be pushed and pulled to make changes in words and numbers in the UDO. But I don't think this is a useful approach to having an honest conversation and an effective conversation with our constituents. And I hope we can improve upon this. And I did share about a month ago some information with the committee and planning staff about some other tools and options that are out there to study things like this for people that do things like that. I would say I didn't get a response from anybody on the committee or staff that I shared that with. So happy to revisit that if possible, but I hope we can ultimately come through with a much better tool. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Winston. Do we have other, Ms. Watlington or Mr. Eggleston, do you have any questions or comments? Okay, I'll go ahead and take the other point of view, the counterpoint. I actually think that this is useful information. I'm not sure it goes far enough. I think, you know, for example, I'd like to see, maybe this will come out in the final report, but take an actual case study and give us the difference, right? If a certain piece of land is developed in a certain way prior to the UDO versus after the UDO, and let's say affordable housing project, I'd like to actually know the difference in cost, and that's what probably should go to our Economic Development Committee. But aside from that, I do have some questions, and I appreciate more of the granular detail on this because I think it's really important. So a couple things. The resolution of unintended consequences, I'd like to know what our permanent solution is going to be when we pass the UDO to unintended consequences. We've talked about having an opportunity to have a period of time, sort of a parallel track, and I know that's a little bit problematic from state law standpoint, but I think we have to have some time in place where we can have some flexibility after we figure out really what the unintended consequences are of, say, not having that overlap of green space and tree save. Not, because right now, you can count that all in as one, and it accomplishes the same goals, but if you have to separate that, are you really accomplishing what you set out to accomplish? Same for green area. I'd like to know a little bit more about why green area versus open space is a priority. Is it just environmental? When you're putting green area on a roof, we overlook the Federal Reserve Building. I think most of the time that green space is dead. So is that really accomplishing, the green space on their roof, on the Federal Reserve Building? So when somebody accomplishes the requirement for green space and they put it on the roof and it's never maintained, did that really do anything? Same with a green wall. So I'd like to know more information about that. I still have a lot of concerns about the transition from single-family to mixed-use areas between place types. This isn't really, it should be talked about in terms of economic impact, because clearly by the extra allowance, it gives us more developable, more development yield. But is that the right thing to do? So I give an example. I've given this before. There's a 4-story building on the corner of Selwyn and Croydon, and it was built next door to a single-family house, and the topography is a little bit higher, so it is even more dramatic. And the house next door is, I don't know what the setback requirement is now, 50 feet or whatever, but that 4-story building completely took out any sunlight in that residence backyard and lot. I think, that could now go to 65 feet if it's in the right place type. And I still have a lot of concerns over our transition from single family to any of anything beyond N2, I should say. So that's not really economic impact, but we have to have that discussion when the economic impact report indicates that, yes, this is a great idea because you have more development area. And then lastly, I wanted to ask, in one of the first slides, you said that the development yields are generally similar between before and after. What does that really mean?
So I'll answer that. What we did is we looked at back to your original question, we looked at development under the current regulations as well as under the UDO, what would be allowed. And we ran models where we actually planned each of these different parcel types, both prototype sites, but also specific sites, to understand how much, what the intensity of development would be that we would get in both of those scenarios. And in general, what we were finding is there was very close equivalence between what you could build under the current ordinance or what we would build typically today in Charlotte and what you would get under the UDO. And so those 4 sites where the graphics were unfortunately shifted for some reason, those were all actual sites, and they were part of an analysis that looked at what was originally built on those sites, so what you could do today, and then what you could do under the UDO.
Okay, so it's not actually, it's a financial yield, not necessarily a.
It's both.
Okay.
It's both a financial yield and a development yield. So, for instance, it would be, I'm making this up, at 180 parking spaces and 240 residential units and 10,000 square feet of retail. And so we then took each of those sites and we determined what you could do under the UDO with a high level of specificity. So could you build the same project? If you couldn't build the same project, could you modify the planning of the project and still get the same or slightly increased yields? And we generally found that was the case.
Okay, I see. Will we get case study examples with this full report?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Could you address my question about the green area? What are we trying to accomplish with green area, and does that achieve it with walls and roofs?
I'll speak briefly on that. I think Laura might be able to respond more specifically because I think it's a goal and part of the UDO. But I think what's happened is we've got a number of broadly described open space areas that have different goals, and they're set up in 3 different areas. There's internal planning, there's green area, which is part of the Tree Save program, and there's open space, which could be more clearly defined as usable open space, so the kind of open space on a parcel that we might be able to use. And I think through the draft process, these things have remained slightly siloed, and what the city staff is working on right now is a way that there would be more overlap in allocating each of these different kinds of open space to fulfilling the requirements for the overall open space in each particular parcel. I'll also say that with green area, and this is one thing to keep in mind, is that there is an opportunity in tiers 3 and 4, which are the denser site types in the matrix that describes green area types, that you can buy that out. And the benefit to that is it means that someone could buy that out. It then goes to the city, and the city can use those funds to create green area that gets aggregated across a number of different projects. So building a park, for instance. So there is flexibility already built into the draft UDO that allows that to happen. That's not the case with open space right now, but I know that the staff is looking at some alternatives. But it's really just siloed areas as it was originally set up, and we're working to try to get more continuity and flexibility within that entire structure.
Okay. I don't know how my colleagues feel about it, but if that's the goal, then I'd rather see, green area be an offset in fee and lieu instead of putting it on a roof. Because I just don't think that's a long-term, just doesn't feel like a long-term solution to what the outcome we're trying to achieve. Anybody else can weigh in on that, but.
That is possible under the current requirements or the current regulations in the draft UDO.
Okay, my other issues with the 40 to 65 feet and the resolution of unintended consequences, I'll take up at a different time because it's not really economic impact. Do we have other
Mayor Pro Tem,
councilmen?
just
Yes.
one brief comment on the roof thing. I can appreciate the idea that it's maybe not as beneficial as other ways that might manifest, but I don't want to discourage it either, because it's certainly good for air quality, water quality, and frankly, beautification of Center City. There's not much uglier than being in one of our tall buildings and looking down on others that are just, kind of a dingy, dirty roof with a bunch of HVAC in it. So
Sure, but I think, most people get benefit by having that green space down on the ground where everybody can access it.
I think there's more value to getting it in the forms that you discussed there, but I don't think there is still some value on the roof thing. So I've actually, in the past, as we've had these discussions, encouraged us to encourage folks to activate their rooftops. And again, that air quality and water quality is not something that may be visible to people, but it is a benefit that everybody reaps. So that's it.
I will say in that situation, it's interesting because the rooftop green areas are incentivized, but they're incentivized at a lower multiplier than ground level green area. And so it works out fairly well, and it actually addresses the concerns that each of you has.
Okay, thank you. Did you have a comment, Mr. Winston?
About the green space and rooftop, green space conversation, Tree Save in general. I like the ability to have mixes and things, but really the point I would like to make there is that we have to have a conversation with the county as well as it relates to this. I was able to meet with 3 county commissioners, Ms. Craig and Ms. Harmon, and those requirements relate to the ability to create parks and get parks in neighborhoods and open space tree save. As it relates to that process, that's something that Parks and Rec is engaged and involved with, but of course that we don't have the ability from the city side to kind of analyze it from that necessary lens. So I would encourage us, as we're kind of thinking about this particular issue, to find a way, to get feedback from the county commission about best practices or the best path forward.
Okay, great, good idea. Thank you. And Mr. Driggs, our honorary committee member, did you have any comments you'd like to make?
I do, actually, and I am mindful of your comment about trying to separate economic development and TAP, although it's interesting, we're seeing an economic impact analysis here, so that separation is maybe not totally clean. Anyway, quick question, are we going to see a markup in the next draft of the UDO of changes that were made specifically as a result of the economic impact analysis?
We are tracking these issues specifically, and in the report, it details those that will have an impact as a result of this report, yes.
Well, what I'm talking about, though, is I would like to see in the next draft the actual places where the language was changed to accommodate recommendations from the economic impact analysis. And I say this because it's possible to pay a lot of lip service, and then when you go back and say what's really different. So, you know, I hope we will see what really is different. I'll just put that out there, and you can think about it. I'd like to know who the UDO administrator is. What person is that?
Let me, if my audio is working, if I could jump in on the last question and this one, we can certainly make that information available, Councilmember Driggs, on what has changed directly out of this process.
Thank you.
We'll have to
Yeah.
figure out how we do it. And we, at this point in time, the UDO administrator would be a new position, so we don't have a person yet. But that role, as we have talked, would deal with some of the things, run the UDO Board of Adjustment, which would replace our other boards, and also be monitoring how things are going with the UDO and helping with any conflicts that couldn't be otherwise easily resolved.
So,
They could play dual roles. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
All right. Thank you, Laura. But I guess what I'm getting at here is this will be a member of staff, right? It's going to be a new city hire. And in order for them to be effective, I think they will need to have quite a bit of authority. So I'm kind of focused on that role, who that is, how that works. It's a fairly important piece. I will just say that for now. We can talk further about it. I did want to respond quickly to Mr. Winston and point out that his efforts to be diplomatic may not have been entirely successful, but I think he made some good points. There is a macro element here that I also feel is missing. I don't share his opinion that the work that has been done wasn't useful and valuable. I think it is. It has its place, but there are still some things that we're not kind of getting at. I will also say, though, Braxton, some of the issues you alluded to should have been discussed when we were writing the 2040 plan, because we're now operating in a framework, and a few of the things you suggested there were kind of asked and answered during that plan process. And we could talk about this offline. I just want to kind of put that out. But for example, I would like to see in the economic impact analysis just projections on things like, what is job growth going to look like? What will the housing stock look like? There was a reference to 10,000 units. I heard that. But what will the kind of mix of affordability of housing and number of units look like as a result of this? What is the outlook for the tree canopy? We have a policy on trees. I think it's been made part of the UDO, but the macro analysis should just take the things that we care about the most and kind of find a way of quantifying what the outlook is for those things under this plan. And that's a higher level than a lot of the detailed discussion we've heard about, you know, how does that work or what is that site going to do? There's another step here that just says the housing, for example, housing costs are going to go up. We've heard references to the fact that costs will be higher in some respects, and a sort of qualitative suggestion that maybe we can find ways to offset that. But I think we should look harder at that and see whether we're actually accomplishing what we set out to do with the 2040 plan with this UDO. And Madam Chair, thank you. I'll leave it at that. Some of the other questions really are ED questions.
Thank you, Mr. Driggs. I appreciate that. And I do encourage all committee and non-committee members to talk to staff about their concerns, because this is the time to get to really make those adjustments. With that, we're almost almost on time for our CATS presentation. So we've got here today John Lewis, our CATS CEO, and John Howard of CATS, who are going to give us an update on this Lynx Silverline TOD study.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And members of the committee, it's a pleasure to be before you once again. Again, I'm John Lewis, Executive Director of the Charlotte Area Transit System, and with me is John Howard, who is the project manager for our Silverline TOD study. This is really an important project and study that we want to give you an update on. We spent a lot of time discussing the design of the Silverline, and rightfully so, as that will be certainly the largest project that CATS has undertaken. But once the Silverline is finished and up and running, it will more than likely be the largest single infrastructure project undertaken in the state of North Carolina. What CATS has done in the past and continues to work towards, and I believe we've done very well, is delivering infrastructure projects. From the South Corridor of the Blue Line, which opened in 2007, to the Blue Line Extension, which opened in 2018. Those projects have met the mobility goals established in those plans. But one thing we've heard very loudly and very clearly is that while those projects have spurred an unbelievable amount of economic development, we followed a sort of build it and they will come plan for both of those projects. And with looking back and looking at lessons learned through that, while that roughly $2 billion of investment in rail mobility options has spurred well over $4 to $5 billion in economic development, the question remains, did those economic development provide greater good to the entire community? And so we wanted to take a different path with this Silverline project and really look at broader goals of transit-oriented development at the beginning of the project, not at the end of the project. And so we were fortunate to receive 2 federal grants that helped us look at how we could meet the broader development goals of a very different community along the corridor, from Belmont into the west to Center City, Charlotte at the core of the project, to Matthews, to Indian Trails, et cetera. The goals of growth in each of those communities would be very different. And measures of success in each of those communities may be very different. And so we wanted to work with all of our partners along the corridor to, number one, understand what their goals for economic development growth are, what are also the macro goals that they wanted us to help them meet from a mobility standpoint, beyond just how many people we move from point A to point B. And so the transit-oriented development study, I think, is key in meeting those greater goals of economic development, affordable housing, equitable development, and equitable housing development along the corridor. And so as we have come out with the first set of recommendations, we want to test that, get feedback from not only the community, but elected officials in all of the jurisdictions to make sure that we're meeting goals broader than just, again, how many people we move along the corridor. And so that's really the focus of this study and our ongoing equitable TOD study that we just received a federal grant for. And with that, I'll turn it over to John Howard, and John will go through the presentation, and we would be happy to engage any questions after. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Lewis. We can go to the next slide, please. Mr. Lewis already covered a lot of the higher level goals of the project. Again, we did receive that FTA grant a few years ago, and we're wrapping up that study now as we speak. It does cover 3 jurisdictions, Gaston County and the city of Belmont and Gastonia to the west, and then traverses through Center City and then out to Matthews, and then Sound Indian Trail to our southeast. So it's a much different project than we've done before. So the approach is also different. Looking at, kind of the boilerplate things like land use, urban design, transportation, connectivity, but then adding in the new element of equity, anti-displacement, and affordable housing. So next slide, please. So we've talked about this before. We're not planning in a vacuum here. We've got lots of different jurisdictions here. We've got lots of different planning efforts. Within the Silver Line, we have 3 different studies going on. We have the Silver Line Rail Trail that's wrapping up. We have the design and engineering part of this, which is kind of the heavy lift, if you will. And then we have the Silver Line TOD study. And we've been working in tandem with all of our partners, with the Silver Line, and also the Connect Beyond team, the 2040 Comprehensive Plan, and other jurisdictions and their plans. So we're not just looking at this from a Charlotte-centric focus, but also taking into account what other towns and cities are doing. Next slide, please. Just quickly, we started this study about 2 years ago, a little bit over 2 years ago in January 2020, and had different levels of engagement to get feedback into the study. We had meetings with our internal departments, external departments, stakeholders along the corridor itself, neighborhoods. We worked hand in hand with the design team on their community meetings and gathered feedback along the way. And then we had TOD-focused engagement last summer. We had a combination of virtual meetings. We had outdoor meetings to get feedback from the public. And all of that really helped to feed into the recommendations for the study itself, which we're wrapping up now. Next slide, please. So some of the deliverables along the study, we have, again, 31 stations along this corridor. We have existing conditions reports. We have market studies. We have a focus on 7 demonstration areas that we're calling it. I'll get more into that in a second, what that means. But also higher level TOD studies or summaries for the towns of Stallings Indian Trail. And then the space between the city of Belmont and Gastonia, some high level recommendations for what happens in those key nodes in that space. And also implementation strategies. And this is going to be available on our website for the public to consume. Next slide, please. We spent a lot of time talking about what is TOD with the public and also our partners, and letting folks know that it doesn't have to look like South End or NODA. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. That was a big concern of the towns to our east and west. And also that the new part of this plan, again, is focused on talking about equity and affordable housing. That's the new component of this plan that was very intentional from the beginning. Again, looking at lessons learned, Mr. Lewis stated before about what we got right along Blue Line and BLE, but also where we kind of fell short in not looking at those issues of housing and displacement. And that's very intentional in this plan to put that out forward instead of being reactionary. Next slide, please. So again, I won't go through all these points on here, but again, TODs kind of have the similar components to it. That is the urban form, setbacks, the pedestrian environment, connectivity, how people can get to and from stations, different station types. And again, the big takeaway here is that every station area will not look alike, nor should it. The scale can be different in different areas. So we want to really have this plan and speak to what those different elements are. And that, again, it speaks to the context of an area, not just where it is today, but also where it could be in the future. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So again, we had lots of different types of public engagement opportunities. We had online surveys. We had lots of in-person meetings and virtual meetings. We had a virtual open house that wrapped up late last year to get the feedback from the community. Next slide, please. So within the plan itself, it does call out some of the common themes that we heard. Again, protecting single-family communities, looking at preservation of important structures and amenities in the communities, but also making our corridors safer for cyclists, motorists, pedestrians. So that was kind of a common element throughout the plan, and also, again, to protect that character in the small towns and not to have TOD kind of take away what people feel that's important from an urban framework in those other jurisdictions. Next slide, please. Another thing that we did that's kind of unique within this study was to conduct 2 ULI panel discussions. One that focused on setting the stage for TOD in small and large cities, and the second was talking about equitable TOD. So we convened a group of experts in planning and development and small business development from across the nation and locally, and those will be available on the ULI Charlotte website. We did that back in the May of 2021. And some of that feedback that we received and commentary from the panelists did feed into the recommendations within the study itself. Next slide, please. And Mr. Lewis mentioned our next step is our Equitable TOD grant that we just received about a month ago. And that's going to be an extension of the recommendations from the plan itself that I'll talk more about in the next few slides. And one very important part is to build capacity for support within the community where we have underserved environmental justice issues and underserved populations who may have difficulty getting to and from places where they need to work or go to school or what have you, and how we can build support from that standpoint. And then the second piece of that is to prioritize what improvements need to happen on the ground, kind of physical improvements and what really are important to help people access transit and to get to where they need to be. And I'll talk more about this in more detail in the future slides here. Next slide, please. Within the plan, of course, we have station area concepts where we have some high-level recommendations for most of the stations, but we did focus and drill down in detail on those key demonstration station areas. Next slide, please. You can advance one more slide. On this, we called out these demonstration station areas. There's one in the city of Belmont where we did a kind of a deeper focus on urban design, market conditions, market analysis, housing strategy. We have another on Wilkinson Boulevard around the Remount and Ashley Station. We have another at the 11th Street station area in Uptown Charlotte. The fourth is around the Bojangles Coliseum, Bowplex area. The next is East Charlotte around the Village Lake multifamily area and McAlpine Greenway Station area. And then we have the last in the town of Matthews and downtown Matthews. So those are kind of our focus areas where we did a little bit more detailed analysis on what those places could look like in the future and also the market capacity there. Next slide, please. So within the study, this is an example of what that demonstration area analysis looks like. We have, starting from the left, we have 5 kind of indicators of what's there now and what needs to be improved upon. So we have an analysis on walkability. The higher the number, the better. Opportunity sites for redevelopment. That could be vacant land or underutilized property. We look at the office and hotel markets and also transit connectivity and where we need to make those connections with bus, transit, or streetcar or other methods. We also looked at existing affordable housing in the area and also what the market could be for future affordable housing. And not that this would be an exact number, but it kind of gets a general idea of how many could be delivered. As we learned from Blue Line, those numbers could be very low, if you will. We anticipate a lot of growth, and we already are seeing a lot of growth on Wilkinson Boulevard for sure. And also on the east side, we're getting a lot of applications in for new development. So we expect to see more housing and mixed-use development coming online here in advance of the Silver Line construction being underway. And then on the right, far right, we have just kind of an idea of, from an urban design standpoint, of what that density could look like, what the connectivity could look like as far as the streets and access to greenways, rail trail, and included, and overall what the scale of this area around the station could be, which is generally a half mile around the station. Next slide, please. We also include, again, site plans that call out kind of the big ideas, if you will, where we, again, need to look at preserving certain areas where we could have open space. This is something that we also didn't do in the previous planning studies, and also, again, what the building footprints could look like. And as they approach single family, how those two start to intersect. And again, where we need to connect to those single family residential neighborhoods. Next slide, please. And as we also have in our previous planning studies, an infrastructure plan. That's sidewalks and pedestrian improvements, access for cyclists, and also safety. Where do we have areas where, again, going back to the public's input about making certain intersections and streets safer, where could those improvements be? Also connections to the rail trail and other improvements can be found through a link on the website where it gets into more detail about those. Next slide, please. And within the demonstration station areas, we kind of get into more detail again. This is not a ranking saying this should be number 1, this should be number 2 or 3. This is more of an overall look at where the improvements could be. The ranking methodology would come later, but this is really calling out, here's the major streets, here's where we can make improvements on for safety and connect to, again, rail trail, off-road improvements, maybe new streets that could be built. So again, this is more of a high-level look with input from Charlotte DOT, of course, and others in terms of what these projects could look like, and also maybe what's already in the pipeline in terms of DOT implementation. So we kind of wrapped all that into the study. This is not exhaustive. As we get deeper into the engineering side of this in a few years, this could change. It could be added to, quite possibly, or some of these could already be built by then. But again, this is a list as of now in terms of where we think these priorities should be. Next slide, please. And again, we want to talk about what could be built upon as far as new development versus what should be preserved and saved. So there's also a link on the site, again, with a map that shows those areas that we think where we could have preservation of parks and open space, again, protecting single-family neighborhoods, and also where we see potential for higher density development and where it should be. Next slide, please. So now I'll pivot towards our next effort of talking about equitable TOD. Next slide. Again, this is the newer piece of this study effort. Again, where we did not really talk about this issue before, but we're doing it now. And we're trying to play catch up, right? This is a community-wide conversation. If you heard Councilmember Graham this morning on Charlotte Talks, he talked about this, about our need for affordable housing, not just along our transit lines, but in our whole city and region. It's becoming an issue. One kind of good news story on this, the number that you see, the $4.5 million, those dollars are committed for the Housing Trust Fund through our new TOD height bonus option. So we are getting commitments. That's a new element that went into the zoning ordinance a couple of years ago. So those are commitments mostly along the blue line to the south. So mostly it's dollars, but we also got a few commitments for units, 207, with 56 of those below 30% AMI. So there are some good stories that are happening as far as affordability goes along Blue Line. And BLE also has lots of projects coming online that are actually being built, whether it's affordable workforce housing or whether it's senior housing. What we're seeing now, lots of things coming online just through the market itself. Next slide, please. And there are a number of resources that are already in place that's kind of managed through the Housing and Neighborhood Services Department. So we, again, we have lots of tools in our tool bank here that I think would be applicable to the Silver Line. So I think this is not just a citywide list of resources, but also something that we could leverage in partnership with our housing folks. And I mentioned the second bullet from the bottom, the TOD zoning height bonus. That's something, again, that's fairly new that we implemented in. Wasn't quite sure if that would be a good carrot, but it has been, as we've seen. I think it's going to become much more attractive and also help support the Housing Trust Fund budget. Next slide, please. So as far as the ETOD strategy, one of the highest priorities here is to build capacity, again, along the Silver Line, and that's to get feedback from the communities along the Silver Line to support and promote good ETOD strategies. Second is to embed some principles into the planning process. I'll get more into that in a second. And then make equitable TOD required in some instances, whether it's through zoning, make it easier and just more predictable for the whole community and for the development community. Next slide, please. So here's some examples of how that would look. Again, this touches just about everything that we do within the city. There's a new idea about creating an ETOD program and work plan that would focus on just the station areas along the Silver Line and perhaps even the Blue Line. That's a new idea that we're looking at, and that really came out of that conversation with the ULI panel. I think Austin, Texas has a model like that, and Atlanta has a model like this, where they have a dedicated staff that focuses on transit station areas and applying those ETOD principles to those areas and leverage funding to get land banking and to get affordable housing in those station areas. Community engagement is something that we're going to be working on ongoing. Land use and zoning, there's transportation, health and safety, so we touch on some of the county work as well. Preservation in terms of community history and culture, looking at parking, and also small business. We kind of focus on housing, but there's also a need to look at displacement of small businesses, and also how do we retain and train for new small businesses within the station areas. And also development incentives, so that we can get the kind of land uses to make those complete station areas, but not just have kind of monoliths of just market rate types of things, but also have the kind of uses that people need to get to, the daycares, neighborhood serving retail, grocery stores, food service, those kinds of things. So we don't try to incentivize that kind of growth as much as we can. Next slide, please. There are some recommendations about anti-displacement measures and affordable housing, again, within the plan itself. And some of these are already underway in different aspects, but I think the big takeaways are, we got to somehow attain the land so we can kind of control our own destiny, if you will. It's hard to kind of keep up with the market. They're out there buying apartment complexes and converting what are NOAHs or naturally occurring affordable housing apartment units and converting those to market rates. So we can try to keep up and get ahead of that is very challenging. But I think our housing department is doing a very good job of getting what we can and leveraging that and sending out the RFPs for new affordable housing projects. And we got some of those in the pipeline. And there's other ideas here about creating a community land trust, which again is already a model that's underway with the West Side Land Trust that kicked off a couple of years ago. So I think that's a great model that's already there, but how can we maybe build upon that and have a land trust in other areas? So I think this list, again, is not exhaustive, but they do kind of, I think, spark conversations about what we need to prioritize and have as a conversation as we move towards the next process of the Equitable TOD grant that we just received. Next slide, please. And again, in the plan itself, we did identify areas that could be great opportunities for land banking. These could be properties that are owned by the public, whether it's the city or county, but it doesn't exclude areas that could be privately owned land that sometimes people could maybe donate for housing, which has happened in the past, or sell for different types of public-focused projects. So this is just a way to kind of look at what's along the corridor now at a very high level. It doesn't take into account every publicly owned property because some have plans already attached to them, but just gives an idea of kind of the footprints that could be there and to really get that critical mass, if you will, to have a really impactful development within a station area. Next slide, please. And again, we had some very high-level numbers about how many units could be located within those demonstration areas. And again, this is looking at both market and affordable housing, so having more of a mixed income housing availability around these stations. Again, this is within like a half-mile radius of a station, so again, these numbers could be a lot higher. But again, this is taking just kind of a current look, what could the build-out be within the next 5 years or so. But again, as we've seen on Blue Line, these numbers could definitely increase given market demand.
John, can you just go back to that for a second? I don't mean to interrupt, but
Yes.
how do you come up with those numbers? I'm not sure I understand what that really represents.
We did have a housing subconsultant on this project, and they looked at vacant land and other market indicators to come up with the numbers. So I couldn't get into the details of that, of how they analyzed that, but we could provide that information for you in more detail if you like. Certainly. Next slide, please. And just to kind of go back and maybe talk about what's happening now, to kind of give you an idea of what could happen in the future for Silver Line. These are numbers for Blue Line and Blue Line Extension of what's being constructed or what's under construction or being planned. So we've got a number of developments, again, along the Blue Line Extension. We've got lots of multifamily, whether it's more workforce or whether it's senior housing. We've got some units that are kind of embedded within a market rate housing development, such as townhomes in NoDa. You see there's 6 units within one that has 59 units. There's 6 within 55. And these are House Charlotte eligible projects. So we're getting, small numbers within a few, and we're getting some that are complete affordable housing projects. So it's kind of running the gamut, if you will. And under planned, we've got some coming up around Skelly Bark along the Blue Line. We have a couple of parcels at the Arrowwood Station that have just been submitted. We have another coming up at UCB along Blue Line Extension, and then a few more coming up at Old Concord and McCullough along Blue Line Extension. So there are affordable housing projects in the pipeline, or again, have been completed or under construction. So I think that the other maybe talking point here is that even though we didn't plan for it when it was constructed, we're getting those units coming in as we speak. So I think that's a good news story that we need to probably talk more about when this issue comes up. Next slide, please. And some next steps. As I said, we're wrapping up the station area planning piece now. So now we will continue to work in tandem with the design and engineering team as they move from 15% to 30% design. So they are actively receiving comments now on the 15% design plans. So again, the study will be there, and if it needs to be updated along the way, we will certainly do that. But for now, they'll keep using some of that data as they continue their design and engineering work. And I believe they're going to come to you the next few months or so to talk more about the next steps for the design and engineering plans. Next slide, please. And if you want more information, of course, and to view the final report, that is the web link, www.catsilverline.com. You can download the entire plan from there. And if you need more information, you can contact myself or Monica Holmes in planning. We worked in tandem with this, and along with our consultant, Kittleson and Associates, who did a really good job in coming up with this planning study that was, again, it's unique to us. There are models like this around the country, but I think that our approach with this was very inclusive and just kind of thinking outside the box and getting some new ideas on the table for us to think about. Well, again, we talk about equity and what that means and how to get more community input. And again, the next step of this would be to get the next grant implemented. We're just in the beginning stages now, talking about how we refine the scope of that grant. So I think we'll be coming back to you in the next few months when we get that more refined as we start to kick off that work and issue the RFP for consultant services on that. That would not be a staff-led initiative. We would bring in a consultant again to help with managing that project. So again, it would be more of a community engagement focus, not so much talking about the alignment, not so much talking about any of the design details, but really talking about more of building capacity and building support for the Silver Line.
Okay, thank you. My first request is going to be, can we get this presentation in bigger? Because I can't read it. And if you scan that, would you get the whole presentation that you just gave?
That would actually go to the planning document.
Oh.
So, yeah.
Yeah,
We can provide the presentation to you.
Okay, because if we got, I think if we had it on, each slide is a screen, we could read it, which would be good.
Absolutely.
I'm pretty nearsighted, but I can't read that.
I got pretty good vision. I'm in the same boat,
Yeah. So that would be good. There's a lot of rich information in there. Thank you for the presentation.
Certainly.
I'm just going to whip through my questions real quickly, and then I'll let the rest of the committee go. I remember this question from a couple years ago, but I'm not really sure about the answer. At what point, so we're at the 15% design point, right? And that's what the 50 million that we approved a few years ago approved.
That's correct.
Okay, for 15% design. At what point can we use federal transportation dollars to buy right-of-way?
So we have currently, I'm going to use the term pre-authorization to acquire right-of-way. And the MTC, we have set aside funding to acquire some right-of-way. We've actually gotten two pieces. Number one, the Norfolk Southern parking lot in Uptown across from Gateway Station. We are in the process of acquiring another piece of property along Independence. There is a car dealership that is right in the critical part of the alignment. We are in process of negotiating that acquisition. So we're in that phase now. Although we can't use federal money for that, we're using local money for that. But as the project continues, we can use that as local match in the future for the project.
Okay, so the timing issue isn't a problem.
Right.
So with that, how much right-of-way, and bearing in mind that you hopefully would get a match then, how much, what's the distance on either side of your alignment that you typically buy right-of-way?
So typically, and I'll let John, we have kind of a model for the, it's generally 70 feet for the corridor from center line to center line, so roughly 150 feet for the rail corridor. The station area plans, which John alluded to, depends on where the station is and what are the other goals. CATS, from a mobility standpoint, we have a model for what a station will look like, both as a standalone and stations that may be incorporated into larger developments. But the point of this study was to think outside of just the mobility aspects and how do we incorporate broader goals, housing, et cetera, into it. There is a limit to what CATS can do as a transit agency. We're not in the land banking business, but I think one of the key slides that John put up was the one that showed all of the public property. And so an important part of this is identifying public property, what we can use, and work with the partners in the private sector and in the nonprofit community and with our partners at City Housing, say, how can we all work together to generate the biggest, to leverage the biggest response to this investment.
Okay, and that's kind of where I was going with that. When you do acquire the right-of-way, how much further can we go and not jeopardize federal funding, whatever, to include in land bank for affordable housing? And correct me if I'm wrong, but that really wasn't part of the process in the Blue Line? It was just so long ago that it just wasn't? part of the
Well,
process.
I think in the Blue Line, lessons learned. We
Yeah.
figured we identified the stations, we acquired the land needed for stations, and in some cases like Scaly Bark, we were able to work some additional acquisitions for our parking lot that has later currently become a joint development with a private sector developer. But there are some limits to what we can do. And so why we're doing this now is to work to identify the locations, sort of outline our limitations, but then work with other partners to say, here's what we can do. What can we do together to leverage and
Absolutely.
maximize the impact of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
And I think it was that aspect that we missed on the Blue Line and Blue Line extension. We looked at it really through our own lens of, this is a rail project, here's what we can do, and here we'll purchase the stations, and let the market determine the rest of the
Which
development.
15 years ago, or whatever that would have been, maybe more, it was a very different conversation.
Sure.
So, okay, thank you. Mr. Wilson?
Thank you. So I was talking to Mr. Driggs a little bit. I'll try to actually keep to my more diplomatic stance than the
Most
last question.
diplomatic.
Yeah, I'll try.
No promises?
Yeah, no, definitely no promises. So, because a little bit is about sort of relates to the feedback I gave for the last one. I think this is actually pretty good in terms of presenting the macro around transit stations and areas and planning. But I think it's still missing that look back. I know this is a great, this is very good for us as we're starting to think about policy implementations and some decisions that we have to make. But let's be honest, this has to be a great tool to go out and have conversations with our community, right? To understand why this is important and to gain support for this in the various places and stages that we're going to, need a lot of support from the community at large. I think it would be very helpful for us, because what they're asking, for instance, with the Black Political Caucus of Charlotte-Mecklenburg, they made some demands. What I heard from those demands was a question, how is this going to be different than the Blue Line, right? And you've laid that out by presenting this great presentation, but we're not necessarily telling the story of why the development along the Blue Line happened in the way that it did, right? We know that is because of land use decisions, mostly land use decisions that were not made that allowed certain types, that did allow certain types of development, but didn't allow the type of development we wanted and desired. I don't think people necessarily understand that part, and I think that's going to be an important part for us as we move forward to show them, right? A lot of people think that the city of Charlotte and Katz went and built developments and decided we wanted this type of development there, we wanted this type of housing, right? So how can we go and talk about why New Bern Station developed the way it did, right? What is happening on J.W. Clay now that you do have TODs, but it wasn't necessarily planned for? And what can we kind of look forward to, in doing something that, is brand new? I think that's going to be an important tool for us, for all of us, to truly answer the questions, because that's where the frustration comes from. When we're saying, look, we hear you, this is how we're going to do it. They have no way, the public has no way of kind of squaring that circle,
So, Councilman, I think that's a really interesting perspective, because we have been, up until this point, thinking about, all right, we understand where we missed the mark in our other projects, and we're working towards fixing that looking back. But I think, to your point, everyone else doesn't understand how development happened along the Blue Line and Blue Line extension. So perhaps we ought to go back and outline the story of those investments and then tell how we're doing it differently in this one. So that's a good point. We'll take that.
I would say even perhaps, maybe not, well, I don't know. I'll let you guys, because this is something we can work on. Maybe not outline at the very beginning, but really literally compare, right? Like we didn't have a stationary plan. Now we'll have a stationary plan. We didn't have TOD zoning, right? We had our industrial, brownfield. I don't know. But maybe it's not just outlining at the very beginning. Maybe it's telling that story kind of as we go. With that, I got two more things. Liz, John, I think he was very, very specific in saying, mentioning CAT's specific kind of right-of-way land acquisitions, right? He said 70 feet to 70 feet, about 150 feet. But we know that the Silver Line, again, this is part of telling this story to the public, right? We know that the Silver Line is part of the greater transformational mobility network. Again, certain people really just don't know what that means. They just think the Silver Line is the Silver Line, and that's what the transformational mobility network. But we know that to really implement that, I think we're going to need more right away than just the CATs right away when we start to think about bike ped and things like this. One, is that an accurate assessment of the needs? And if yes, what are we doing, or what could we be doing around land acquisition in regards to what to build or in partnership or to complement what CATS is doing around land acquisition and right away?
Yes, sir. Great question. And as John mentioned, we do have a little bit of experience under our belt with both the Blue Line and the Blue Line extension. And so now as we work together in partnership to consider how to design a successful Silver Line, we're absolutely not only looking at the development that supports that transit corridor, but also the accessibility and mobility needs as well.
Is this a time, I know we haven't necessarily solidified what the transformational mobility network is, but it seems like the ability to deliver on these ideas that are proposed is going to be necessary. Is there anything, I guess, not that we should or could be doing, but is there anything that could be preventative if we don't start thinking about right now as it relates to the ability to do things with dirt that would put the kind of goals and aspirations of this plan in jeopardy if we don't kind of match land, I guess, if that's...
Yeah, so the way I'll answer that is, as we consider the transformational mobility network, we are thinking about not just transit investment and specifically rail, but we're also thinking about accessibility as it relates to getting people to those station areas. We're also considering accessibility for our buses, because our buses are traveling on the same streets as the congestion that people experience when they're in their cars. And so there is a non-transit component, as we describe it, and when we talk about this transformational mobility network. And so we're absolutely thinking about those things in the future.
Again, I think that's going to be, it is something that, as we're having these conversations with our constituents who are very engaged and about this, I think we need to be able to talk to them effectively about that. That last slide that you meant that Mayor Pro Tem had questions about the not the last slide, but the slide about growth in units in Belmont and sorry, I'm trying to get to it. Yeah. Slide 32, Belmont and Matthews. This brings me back to the kind of idea that City Council needs to be in communication and talking with other electeds in our region. What you put here really, to me, highlights that I think now is the time that we really need to be talking, for instance, with the town councils of Belmont and Matthews. And I'd like to explore how we can have, if they feel the same way, or if our city council feels the same way. I know we had a vote a couple months ago that said we didn't, to have a joint meeting to talk about transit-oriented development, land use. It seems like in order to, while we, of course, all three of us will have to pass our own policies, we're trying to create a cohesive and comprehensive system. And to do that, I think we should have either a mutual understanding or have understandings of what each other are thinking, what other communities need, and what their constraints are. But also, I think from a practical standpoint, efficiency and efficient uses of your time, right? You're not just Charlotte's transit system. If there's an opportunity to have one meeting as opposed to 3 meetings, I feel like that could be a much better way to move things forward. So is that something that could be helpful at this point in time? I guess, how do we get there? How can you help me convince my colleagues that this is something that we need to do?
I think it is certainly something that is worthwhile, and I would say just by the fact that particularly for this study, you had not only interest from Belmont, Matthews, and Stallings and Indian Trails, that they also participated in the funding of this study. And so whereas we're at different points in the funding of the construction of the project, all of the jurisdictions along the corridor realize that this is an important aspect of the success of this project, and they all came forward from a funding standpoint. So I think that bodes well for this kind of discussion. Let us go back and think about how we can bring that group together and how we do it in a way that, doesn't violate sunshine laws or et cetera. But point well taken, and we'll come back to you on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that'd be a great opportunity. And I know some of us are having conversations just offline with other electeds in those towns, but I think it would be great to be able to have one conversation. All right, I'm just going to mention we only have 10 minutes left because we do have a hard stop at 12:30. Do any of the other committee members have any questions? I see okay, both. So go ahead, Mr. Eggleston, and then Ms. Watlington.
I'll be real quick. I don't disagree with Mr. Winston that those conversations need to take place. I don't think anyone needs convincing of that, and they are taking place both offline in individual conversations, but also online in groups like the Central Atlanta Council of Governments and CRTPO, MTC, whatever, all these organizations that are regional and have these kinds of focuses, these conversations are ongoing. So if more people want to engage in those, I think that would be welcome. But without repeating a bunch of stuff that's already been said, I will just say I'm glad to see that we have more of a focus in this presentation on land banking than I feel like we've seen in any other presentations up to now. And maybe it's a conversation that, as was the case earlier, we said something maybe could be brought to the Economic Development Committee for unpacking. Maybe the Great Neighborhoods Committee could unpack some of this focus on land banking, but I do think we've got to be super proactive on that, because as we get further along in terms of design completion and approaching a readiness to build a silver line, those property values are going to go up. The demand from private developers to purchase and build out those parcels is going to increase. And so, yeah, I hope we will find a way to be really aggressive. And I think if we do find a way to do that, we can rest assured we're not going to lose money that we invest in land along a future transit corridor. So whether we end up doing what we exactly hoped to do with the land, I think we've got to go ahead and acquire it. We've got to go ahead and have some restrictions on land that we control that says this is what we want to see happen here. We want to make sure that there are places for people to live along these transit corridors at different price points. So, anyway, just wanted to call out my appreciation for that being such a big focus in this presentation.
Madam Chair, if I could just respond quickly to that. I think, Councilman Eggleston, that is, if we take nothing else from this presentation, that's probably the single most important point. We've got to find a way to bring very diverse groups, versus both governmental and non-governmental, very diverse departments within the city. It's not just CATS, it's CDOT, it's housing, it's the private sector, it's the non-profit community. How do we leverage all of the different tools that each one of those entities may have to move towards a single outcome? And so I think, to your point, we've got to think beyond just the mobility aspect of this. This probably is going to require more, the TOD aspect of it is going to require more cross-council, cross-government discussions than probably the design of the rail line itself. And so we have to do that if we're going to be successful in this. So I hope that John and the rest of us will be in other committees talking about the broader goals of this than just the mobility aspects.
Thank you. And we do have, Mr. Phipps is listening in, so we have at least 5 council members who got that message. We need to share that with our colleagues and make sure that's a priority. Go ahead, Ms. Watlington.
Absolutely. So much of what I was thinking has been shared by some of my colleagues. So I just want to drop home the point that, given exactly what Mr. Lewis just said, this is crucial. We're essentially building a no city, if you really look at it across the region. And I think that this has to be a shift in how we approach all of our plans. It's got to be about more than just the city of Charlotte. The other thing I will say is I have to stress that we've got to get more intentional and effective about how we reach our neighborhoods, particularly, I'll speak for the west side. As I look at the maps and what falls within TOD, there are so many of the same areas that we have listed as vulnerable to displacement. And when we talk about preserving existing affordability and looking at that net loss of affordable units and looking at who's impacted, and even considering what the Black Political Caucus has stated as important goals in terms of equity in development along this line, I would like to see a very robust communication plan that's ongoing, that integrates the neighborhood associations, that integrates the anchor institutions that are along these corridors, that integrates the nonprofit organizations that work along these corridors, something that is beyond what we've seen in the past as it relates to some of our planning initiatives. There's been definitely a lot of work, but I think it's going to take a whole nother level of engagement because we've got so many intersecting needs here. This is critical, especially in West Charlotte along this Silver Line. So that is something that I would like to see sooner rather than later, because I think it's going to be the linchpin in how we do this successfully. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Watlington. Did you have a comment, John?
I would just say real quickly, part of the ETOD grant that we received has some resources that we can set aside to help build some capacity in neighborhoods and communities that may not be as well organized as others. And so I think in that outreach strategy is not just about going to the same groups and the same contacts that we have in the past. Some of this may be about developing capacity in communities that don't have it today. And so one of the things we're working on, we have some resources from federal funding for that, but we're also talking with some of the philanthropic groups to help match or that may be able to provide some additional funds for that. So we may have to create capacity where there isn't currently that.
Absolutely. And to that end, I'd like to ask you all to come to this month's Affordable Housing or Great Neighborhoods Committee meeting and share this report with that committee as well, because there are so many overlapping components. I would like to see you all in the next couple of weeks for that. So if you could please reach out to Mr. Heath, that'd be great.
That's a really good idea if you're able to do that, because I think you're going to get different audiences, not just council members, but different audiences that are going to hear this information.
Right.
and get them to be a part of it and bring them up the learning curve. So thank you for that suggestion. Okay,
It's a committee structure,
committee structure?
good use of committee.
Good use of committee structure, thank you.
I just want to confirm, I didn't hear Mr. Lewis. You may have nodded, I can't see you. I just want to confirm that you're going to.
Yes, we will, whether it's the next one or we'll reach out to Sean and feel how we can get onto the schedule as soon as we can. But yes, absolutely heard you, and we will do that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. If there's no other questions or comments, staff, do you have anything else you want to close with, or?
No, great feedback, and appreciate the platform, and look forward to the
Yeah.
next opportunity, so.
Thank you, and just as a reminder, if we could get the full presentation for those of us who can't read that, which is probably everybody, so. With that, we'll go ahead and I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Second.
I'll second. Thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate it.